All right. Well, this is a little bit of a different episode of the Graham and Sophia podcast. There is no Sophia this week. Just going to be me and got Jax hanging out here. So he's going to be my co host for this episode. And we just watched the Italian GP in Monza. And there's a good amount of stuff to talk about. So first, we're going to go through the race results. We had Verstappen P1, Perez P2, and Sainz P3 for the podium. Following that, we had Leclerc P4, Russell P5, Hamilton P6, Albon P7, Norris P8, Alonso P9, and Bottas P10. So that's our top 10 for the Italian GP. I guess the only one this year because we didn't have Imola due to the flooding. So I'm just gonna, for now on, call it the Italian GP. And I think just before we get into any of the details, I'll give a race rating. I think that the race was pretty entertaining. We didn't have any safety car restarts or red flags, anything like that, but there were some good battles. We had the Albon train, the Ferraris going at it, the McLarens, and Williams and Mercedes going at it. And then there's a good battle for P10, which wasn't really shown. But overall, I think it was a pretty solid race. So I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Now, let's look back at our predictions, go through mine and then Sophia's. So, my podium prediction for this race was Max P1, Lewis P2, and Carlos P3. So, I got the freebie, of course. Didn't get Lewis P2. I kind of thought Mercedes would be a little bit better than they were here, but I think they kind of struggled with drag similar to McLaren. I think they have a little bit less drag and a little bit less downforce, maybe. So, kind of that's why they finished ahead of McLaren. But yeah, no podium for Lewis. But Carlos got P3. I had a feeling that Ferrari was going to go all out for this GP, just do whatever they can, spec out their car just for Monza, try to somehow get a race victory from Max, but all they could do was P3. They There was potential possibly for a double Ferrari podium for P2 and P3, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. And my wild prediction was Logan Sargent Q3. Didn't happen. I had a little bit more hope for Williams. I mean, Albon did great. He qualified fourth, I think. Was he the fourth or fifth? I know but he did well. Logan definitely had the pace in the car to do it. I think he just had a bad Q2 session. Might have been impeded, but didn't happen. So 2 points for me this week. Moving on to Sophia's predictions. She had the freebie, Max P1. She had Checo P2 and Charles P3. So again, 2 out of 3. She had the other Ferrari getting on the podium, which potentially should have been the case. But only 2 out of 3 points for that. And then her wild prediction, which I did allow, even though I don't think it was something I probably should have, was that George would get a top 5, and he finished fifth. So she gets a point for that. So she got 3 points for this race, and I got 2. Moving on to my moment of the race, I think I'm going to go with the Ferrari battle for that last podium spot and just, well, for the podium because like I was alluding to, I think that there's a chance that they both could have been on the podium instead of Perez. There's some interesting data to back that up that we'll get into the stats section, but it was just entertaining to watch them battling. I think that some of the racing was a little bit over the edge by both Charles and Carlos, mostly Carlos. There were a lot of times where he would do some double moves and kind of push Charles out. But and then also the last lap, I think it was the last lap or the second last lap, they almost touched. And imagine if at Monza at the Italian GP last lap, fighting for a podium, they both crash out. That would have been crazy. I'm sure Freddie Visser was sweating a little bit on the pit wall watching that happen. But overall, it was just an entertaining battle, and Max was gone. Although he did have that engine or temperature problem. I think it was related to the engine or it was tire temperatures, but he dropped off like 3 seconds a lap for the last 3 laps. And I think he was originally ahead of Checo by 12 seconds, but only finished 6 seconds ahead. So, if Yuki's engine didn't blow up and we had those extra 2 laps, who knows? Maybe Checo could have caught up and passed Verstappen for the win. I don't think they would have let that happen, but you never know. I think maybe it was a Honda masterclass to have Yuki's engine blow up because they knew Max would have problems. Who knows? So, moving on to my race controversy, there wasn't really a lot of controversy with this race. I mean, there was a couple moments where people were fighting and there were some penalties. I think my race controversy that I want to talk about is specific to, well, not specific to this race, but something that showed up in this race. It was when Hamilton and Oscar were racing, and Hamilton cut over, basically broke Oscar's front wing, ruined his race, and got a 5 second time penalty, but then was able to get past Norris and Albon and get a P6 finish. And was far enough ahead that the 5 second time penalty didn't do anything. I think there's a lot of situations where a 5 second time penalty for causing a collision isn't really enough. I think this is one of the best examples of it because, you can go ahead and ruin someone's race and then get a 5 second time penalty and it have no effect on you. I don't know if what would be better, maybe for things like track limits. Say you get too many track limit warnings, you get a 5 second time penalty. I think that's more fair. I do like that. I think that before they had the time penalties, they used to do drive-through penalties, or maybe even a 10-second time penalty could be good. I think that if you accidentally or purposely ruin someone's race, you should not be able to easily get a good result. I think there should be a little bit more punishment, and I think that a lot of these collisions, 5 seconds just doesn't really make up for the damage to the other car. So that's kind of my race controversy. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. If you have any suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Send a comment on any of the social medias, and I'll take a look at it. Yeah. So moving on to the stats section. This is a interesting one. So this is kind of what I was alluding to earlier. I think that if Sainz and Leclerc did not battle as hard as they did, and Sainz had let Leclerc through, and they didn't battle and do everything that I was just saying for my moment of the race, there's a possibility that they might have been able to keep Checo behind and get a 2-3 for Ferrari. So this graph here that I got from @break on Twitter basically shows the lap times of Verstappen, Perez, Charles, and Sainz. So you can see Sainz is ahead. They both pit, and Sainz, comes out ahead. Charles is right behind, and then Perez is right behind him. So you can see that, once around lap 30, once Perez gets past Leclerc, Leclerc stays with him. They both catch up to Sainz. They battle. Sainz and Checo battle for 5 laps or so. And then as soon as Checo gets past and it's Leclerc versus Sainz, you can see there's a massive drop off in pace. And I think it's because, almost every lap after that, turn one, someone was blocking someone or they had to go off track. They lost a lot of time and Perez slowly pulled away. I think that if Ferrari, there was the 2 laps, or I guess 1 lap, where Leclerc was behind Sainz right after pitting, and this was before Perez had pit. If they had let Leclerc through on Sainz, and I think it was kind of clear that Leclerc was a little bit faster this race. I mean, he didn't qualify as well. I think if he had qualified on pole, it would have changed everything. But if they had let Leclerc through, I think that Leclerc could have pulled Sainz along, and they could have broken DRS from Checo potentially, because Checo was a little bit slower than Verstappen, as he usually is, and I think similar pace wise to to Charles and Sainz. But just the squabbling and them not making their decision before Perez caught up to them kind of ruined any chance for a double podium. So I mean, it's a what if. Ferrari always says they don't have a number one driver, and they like to let their drivers fight. But I think this is a situation where if they had prioritized Leclerc, they could have fought and held off Checo for two podium spots, second and third, which for the Tifosi and Ferrari would have been an amazing result. So that's my stats breakdown for the week. I think that this is probably the best Ferrari's going to do for the rest of the season. Maybe Vegas, because Vegas is all straights, and the Ferrari for this race was completely trimmed out to straight line speed. So I think maybe Vegas they'll have another good result or have potential for a good result. But it's pretty obvious that they did everything they could to get a good result in Monza. They put in new engines, gearboxes, turbos, everything. I think in both of their cars which I think someone said that gains them like 0.3 of a second per lap compared to their old engines, which is a massive advantage. So that kind of helped close the gap to Red Bull a little bit. Not enough to keep Max behind, but I think it should have been enough to secure a 2-3. So moving on to my meme of the week. This is a classic with Williams and specifically with Albon, but this was tweeted by the Williams F1 account, and it's just wide. And then it's a picture of Alex's car photoshopped to take up the entire track. And you got Oscar, Hamilton, and Lando all in the background, just stuck behind him because there was a chart of the race pace of all the cars. And Oscar was the third fastest on average because he pit after getting front wing damage and was in free air and was able to, show the true pace of the McLaren. If they had been able to pull away from the Williams early in the race, they would have been long gone because the Williams was slow and, the McLaren just did not have the straight line speed to get past. There was actually a post-race interview where Alex and Lando were talking to each other, I think with Will Buxton. And Alex was saying in the pre-race, briefing, they have like a deltas to everyone's straight line speed. And Williams is the fastest and McLaren's the slowest. So their race strategy was just get in front of he was in front of the McLarens because of qualifying, but it was to stay ahead of the McLarens and then you'll be fine. And then the race strategy for the McLarens was do whatever you can to get ahead of the Williams because otherwise we are going to be dead in the water and just stuck behind. McLaren did bring a new low downforce rear wing for Monza to try to, avoid what happened in Spa where they were getting overtaken by 3 cars on the straight after Eau Rouge and Radion. And, it seemed to at least brought them more on a level playing field. They still had their strengths where they were good in the high speed, but it just wasn't enough to get them past the Williams, which is the fastest and the least draggy of the cars this season. So every race that Alex gets like a P7 or P8, it's always because he just has good strategy or good qualifying, gets ahead of these cars and no one can pass him. And I just love that meme that he's just too wide to get past. So that's my meme of the week. All right, time to move on to predictions for the Singapore GP, which is not this weekend, but the next weekend. And for my podium predictions, I've gone for Max P1. He's going to get that 11th win in a row. Unless there's a mechanical failure, I just don't see anyone getting anywhere near Max. I mean, we could have what happened last year where they don't fuel the car up enough for qualifying and then he has to abort his last lap in Q3 and then he starts behind. He also had a terrible race last year. I think he went off the track a couple times and it was a really bad race for Max. I think that he's going to want to do his best to not repeat that, but who knows? It could happen. But it would also be stupid not to go for Max P1. For my P2, I have gone for Lando Norris. Zach Brown and Andrea Stella have said that they are bringing upgrades to Singapore. And if they're anything like the last round upgrades, I don't think they will be. I think they're more minor. Um, but the hope is that these upgrades can push them a little bit further and maybe even clearly into the second best car. And I think that a track layout like Singapore, especially with the new layout where it's a little bit more flowing, so a little bit more high speed corners, will suit the McLaren very well. So that's why I've gone for Lando P2. And for P3, I've gone for Oscar Piastri. I think that he's going to get his first podium of the season, and pretty much for the same reason as Lando. I think that, Lando is amazing at qualifying. He's a great driver, and I think he just has that little bit of edge on Oscar. But I think the car performance is going to make them, at least at Singapore, the second fastest car. Clearly, and the times that Lando's gotten P2 before at Silverstone, they're the second fastest. At Hungary, maybe there's Mercedes, but I think in Singapore they're going to be the second fastest team. So I'm going with Max P1, Lando P2, and Oscar P3. My wild prediction is that there are going to be at least two safety cars. I think that, we've got a couple rookies. Liam Lawson is racing for, well, not confirmed yet, but the rumors are that Daniel Ricciardo's not going to be back until Qatar. So got another couple races with Lawson. So we have Lawson and we have Sargent. And I think that, and we had Piastri, but I think Piastri will be fine. But I think there's just potential for safety cars here. Singapore is a hard track. Everyone says that's one of the most demanding laps on the F1 race calendar. So I think that's two safety cars. I think it's going to happen, and we're going to see an exciting race. All right. Well, we don't have Sophia this week, so again, no predictions for her. Maybe I'll be able to finally catch up some points because I know I'm definitely a little bit behind. And that also means no hinge pickup line of the week. So I think that brings us to the end. And all I got to say is that's gas. Make sure to check us out on all of our socials. And I'll catch you in a couple weeks.